And now, for dessert, flan.
Oh, flan, oh boy.
No!
Come on, kids, flan time!
Flan's here, you guys! Get down here, the flan's here! Flan, kids, flan!
I love flan. Do you love flan? What is flan?
You take a slightly jiggly, a little wobble out of the oven and you cool it before refrigerating it, preferably for several hours overnight, before you turn it upside down to reveal a smooth sauce running over the top of a beautifully baked custard. Today we are speaking about flan, not the one in the pastry that is for another day. No, the one that is most well known around the globe with two names, creme caramel or flan. Hey there and welcome back to my channel. For those who do not know me, my name is Sylvie and I run a baking website called roamingtaste.com. I've also spent many hours studying the history and science and stories into desserts and baking. And this video topic was actually suggested by AM5064. Thank you so much. If you happen to have any desserts or dishes or baking that you would like me to dig into, please do let me know in the comments. Now, in the meantime, let's get into the creamy chronicle. A silky slice in Mexico, a dense castillo in Venezuela, or an elegant creme caramel in France. The story begins in ancient Rome. I'm gonna have to apologize here for any and all mispronunciation I do during this video. There are a few different languages, and clearly my first is English, so I'm very likely going to butcher something. Please and thank you. Now, it doesn't really matter what you call this dessert around the globe. Flan traces its roots back to ancient Rome, where it was known as flador, a term for flat cakes. The Romans created this early version using eggs, milk, and honey, but it wasn't until the Middle Ages that flan began to resemble the dessert we know today. As the recipe spread across Europe, it evolved, incorporating caramelized sugar and different flavorings, as per the timeless delight of flan by Fons. The basis for creating this light custard is thanks to having to be innovative, as Katie Straw explains. The Romans were the first to domesticate chickens, and they found themselves in the middle of an egg surplus, so they used techniques they learned from the Greeks to develop new egg-based recipes. Most versions of the dessert were savory rather than sweet and included flavors like eel sprinkled with pepper, but a few early recorded recipes contained the only sweetener of the day, honey. Personally, I couldn't imagine being served flan flavored with eel, but hey, to each their own. As mentioned in this video, honey was often the only sweetener other than seasonal fruits used throughout most of human history, so it makes sense to see it being used here in this dessert as well. When the Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, flan survived and became the sweet delicacy that gripped the newly conquered lands. Quoting from the surprisingly extensive history of flan, we see in this quote that flan had actually already been introduced to nations outside Rome thanks to their empire, and this is just one of the many things that survived that empire's existence. But in usual style, we also see how time moves ever forward, and we gain some insight into how another beloved custard dish got its intro throughout multiple places across the globe thanks to the history of Parisian flan. The original flan, known as flador or flan, was a pie filled with fresh cheese and prepared with a short crust or puff pastry base. These recipes are mentioned in culinary texts from the Middle Ages and were enjoyed in different regions of Europe. The origins of the word flan is the French equivalent of the Latin word fladon, which comes from the Old High German word flador, meaning flat cake. When we consider that most flan is served as a round dessert, the term flat cake really does make sense because it does resemble a cake, though obviously the texture is incredibly different. Around the same time as some parts of Europe were making flan with fresh cheese and a pastry base, the Moors assisted with some flavorings still used today, such as citrus fruits and almonds. On the other hand, flan has mostly remained the same egg, cream, and sugar mixture over the years. The term Moors refers to people who resided in North Africa and Spain, and this aligns with using citrus fruits and almonds, which are aplenty in these nations, and how some other parts of the globe then came to include different flavorings in their flan also later on. Thanks Thanks to the article Flan, the awe-inspiring 2,000-year evolution, in the Middle Ages, cooks across Europe added sweeteners to the mixture to create a softer custard-like dish. And we see this texture further cemented and added to in the article The Unique History of Flan, a world-traveled dessert by Katie Straw. Of all the peoples introduced to this dessert, the Spanish were particularly taken with it and were the first to top it with a sweet caramel sauce. Like the Romans before them, the Spaniards brought flan to new lands when in 1518 the famous conquistador Hernan Cortes landed in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Now, I did some research on Hernan Cortes, who you could say has a complicated reputation, and this is for good reason.
Never trusted this guy.
The fact he was a part of the first wave of Spanish colonizers in the Americas is likely the reason he is then connected to bringing flan to Mexico. The article, The Surprisingly Extensive History of Flan, noting while there is no direct evidence that Hernan Cortes brought flan when he landed in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula in 1518, the Spanish culinary tradition of flan spread throughout Latin America in the centuries that followed. Once the flan reached the New World through Spanish colonization, the caramel layer was already a defining feature. Flan continued its travels throughout Central and South America, cementing itself within multiple countries where it's still very much beloved today. But Spain didn't just colonize this part of the globe. Nope. Thanks to the article Make Flan Not War by Inkstick, Spanish colonialism brought flan, originally a Roman dish, around the world. Tables not only in New Mexico and the Philippines but across Latin America now feature the creamy custard. Legend has it that Spanish missionaries in the Philippines used egg whites to mix with quicklime to build churches and made leche flan, the Filipino term meaning milk flan with the leftover yolks. And as already mentioned, Spain wasn't the only one who loved flan. France developed its own refined custard dessert, creme caramel. Its ingredients are almost identical to Spanish flan. Quoting there from Flan, the awe-inspiring 2,000-year evolution. And though we've dug into the name flan, well, according to Wikipedia, the names creme, caramel, renversé, French, and crema volteada, Spanish, allude to the custard being turned over to be served. The French version has much more recent documentation than the Spanish, though by this time you could actually say flan had been on its world travels and come back to Europe. The creme caramel, or flan in its modern form with soft caramel on top and prepared and cooked using a bain-marie, is first documented in La Cuisinière Provençale by Jean-Baptiste Ribot, published in 1897. European nations also took their colonization to the Asian continent, because they weren't done yet, where we see it in multiple countries today with flan. The brief history of its travel from Spain to Vietnam, noting the difference between the Vietnamese one and the European ones is that the Vietnamese ones are typically smaller and usually steamed. There are variations of flan throughout the world, from Bangladesh, where it is known as egg pudding or simply pudding. This is a leftover from the Portuguese who settled in Chittagong in 1528 before leaving in 1666, to Cambodia, Thailand, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cuba, Dominican Republic, India, Japan, Philippines, Portugal, Puerto Rico, Spain, Mexico, Vietnam, and France. And to be fair, I'm not actually even listing every single country that has a variation of this dessert. I want to be incredibly clear that it's beloved and has many variations around the globe, with the core components being incredibly similar virtually everywhere. If Pitbull was truly Mr. Worldwide, well, flan would be his favorite dessert. Flan is also not known by the same name throughout the globe, kind of in the same way the name Michael isn't the same in every language. In Vietnam it's called ban flan, whereas we know in France it's called creme caramel. In Chile it's known as leche asada. To be fair, Chile, a lot of people say that's not flan, but I can tell you now from my research, the ingredients to make it are pretty much exactly the same as everywhere else, but it's baked differently. Now, back to it. As the article Flan, the awe-inspiring 2,000-year evolution states, flan has travelled further than most desserts ever will. Yes, this whirlwind history can't really include the homes this dessert has shown up in, the family, special occasions, comfort meals it's been a part of. But the fact that humans the globe over have not just fallen in love with this dessert, but held on to it and made it a part of their lives, speaks to an intrinsic intrinsic value of this dish. If flan were a person, well, it would be the one everyone likes. Now, you might have someone in your mind that you know who is like this. It doesn't matter where they go, who they meet, everyone wants to be around them. And flan is like that. No matter where it goes, it's made itself comfortable enough to become part of the fabric of so many cultures and countless lives. Caramel layer. Flan is effectively a 2-layer dessert, though one of those layers is so minimal that it's basically a sauce. There are still a bunch of things to consider though when it comes to the caramel. So before we get into the how, we need to understand the what. What are the layers of flavor when we have some on the edges of our spoon? Well, Samin Nosrat in her book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat explains it beautifully as usual. As it caramelizes, a single sugar molecule will develop into hundreds of new and different compounds, including some acids. In other words, equal amounts of sugar and burnt caramel by weight are not equally sweet, and in fact, caramel is acidic. In addition to producing acidic flavor compounds, caramelized sugars introduce a slew of new qualities and flavors, including bitter, fruity, caramel, nutty, sherry, and butterscotch. So what does the caramel bring to this dessert? Well, it brings depth, nuance. Without the caramel layer, flan wouldn't be as memorable or have us reach for another spoon as quickly. It's that thin layer of caramel sauce that makes this dessert what it is. Now that we understand the flavors, there is another side to the what we need to consider. What ingredient is required for caramel? Well, as flan reaches so many parts of the globe and each nation makes it ever so slightly differently, we need to go on a bit of a tour. 8 countries to be specific. 3 recipes from each, which accounts for 24 recipes, which by the way, they will all be linked below in the caption. That will be our reference for the ingredients used in this episode to then refer to the scientific elements within both of these layers. According to Ayesha Nemeth Khan on her Substack, caramel is just melted sugar. 13 of the recipes in my research didn't actually specify the type of sugar needed for the caramel, but some did actually include pictures of their caramel cooking, and the sugar looked eerily similar to all the types called for in the remaining 11 recipes. 10 called for granulated or white sugar, which are the same thing, and the remaining 1 was caster sugar. All of these sugars are refined white sugars, though caster sugar has a finer granule. So now most caramel calls for refined white sugars, as this adds a neutral sweetness. Whereas if you were to make caramel with brown sugar, for example, due to it containing molasses, the caramel is more inclined to have a deeper and more complex flavor, which can be a great thing, but that flavor would include a bitterness. Now we've covered the what's, let's get into the how. How is the caramel made? Now there are 2 ways to make caramel. They're referred to as wet and dry. Dry simply means caramel made with just sugar in your pan, whereas wet refers to caramel made with sugar and water. 10 of the 24 recipes call for just sugar. This is the dry method, whereas 13 call for sugar and water. Now this is referred to as the wet method. So let's consider what each is. Flour and Spice notes that wet is a little more forgiving, and according to Ayesha Nemeth Khan on her Substack, water doesn't stay in the finished caramel, it boils away during cooking. But it's like the training wheels on a bicycle. They're at the start to help get you going, then gone when you've reached your goal. And Flour and Spice explains, dry means you sprinkle the sugar in your pan and let it change color. If you're comfortable making caramel, then this approach minimizes crystallization. However, the color change happens more rapidly here, so keep close watch on the color. While Ayesha Nemeth Khan's Substack regarding this type of caramel reflects, without water, sugar melts faster as in the dry method, but requires more precision to avoid burning. Where a recipe is calling for water alongside the sugar, or if you're not a particularly confident baker, you could search for a recipe that does include water to kind of give you those training wheels and help making the caramel sauce. However, if you have a beloved family recipe, or you've come across a recipe that someone has made before and you loved that one, we're going to go over some tips to help provide a little confidence in making dry caramel. Making Baking caramel is actually best done with a pan that has a light color. Now, why does the color of the pan matter? It helps you gauge when the caramel is done much more easily or has reached the perfect level of caramelization, because the color of the caramel is imperative to the flavor. Chef's Resource also advises to avoid non-stick surfaces as they make it difficult to monitor the color transition and often prevent the sugar from heating at the necessary intensity. And King Arthur Baking puts it well in their article, An Expert's Tips to Nail Your Flan, which by the way will be used throughout this episode and absolutely linked in the caption below. Caramel cooked to a light golden color is milder, while caramel cooked to a darker amber color has a more robust flavor. So the lighter the color, the sweeter or lighter the caramel flavor is when compared to like a dark caramel, which tends to have more bitter undertones. Regardless of whether you make a dry or wet caramel, dissolving or heating the sugar evenly is key to achieving a smooth sauce. Medium-low heat allows the sugar to dissolve and caramelize more evenly, and some people actually prefer placing a lid over their saucepan in the first few minutes of their caramelization dissolving process to help distribute the heat more evenly, whilst some sprinkle a portion of sugar into their saucepan, allow it to dissolve, add more sugar, and continue repeating until all the sugar has dissolved. I personally haven't tried either of these methods, so I can't speak for how they might make the process smoother, but all the caramel I have made for my flan is a dry method, so I'm also like very nervous about watching it like a hawk. A point that comes up a lot when cooking the caramel sauce is the question, to stir or not to stir? Well, in the surprisingly extensive history of flan, it is recommended to let it melt and caramelize before giving it a gentle stir, whilst King Arthur Baking advised to only stir if you notice the caramel is browning unevenly. Finally, flour and spice note, but stirring can cause crystallization. Just gently swirl your caramel to get rid of pesky sugar crystals. Now, crystallization has been mentioned a few times, and it's best explained by Chowhound in their article, The Mistake That Causes Crystallizing Caramel and How to Fix It. When you heat the sugar, it melts and turns into a semi-liquid. However, if you're not careful, the sugar will revert to its crystal form, which is how you'll find lumpy and grainy masses collecting at the top of your browned caramel. Sugar will take any opportunity to revert to a solid. And when it comes to stirring or not, Chowhound advises too much agitation can cause the sugar to recrystallize. Now, this is where theory comes into practice, because for the one recipe on Roaming Taste, my aforementioned website, it's a Mexican recipe by the way, and it is made using a dry caramel method. And I've never had much luck with my caramel. I made 3 flans in the lead up to making this video, and for those 3 flans, I made caramel sauce 8 times. And this is because I'm wary of burning my caramel, and therefore I usually cook it until it looks caramel in color, but it's always been on the thicker side, whether I have stirred it or not. Therefore, it's a thick swirly sauce in my pan, and then I pour it into my baking dish, and it is so thick it does not coat the entire base of my dish. This is actually an issue that I've seen crop up in some comment sections, and I needed to solve it because it was virtually impossible to find out why this was happening. Now, a lot of people seem to be asking this question, but they end up with answers regarding the caramel sauce during the unmolding process. So there seems to be like a sense of misunderstanding to what the actual question is. Now, with all of this in mind, I've been following someone on Instagram called Andrea Loret de Mola, who might just make the best flan. I will also include her Instagram linked below. Lots of people say it's the best flan they've ever made from her recipes. Now, her method is to begin breaking up the larger pieces of undissolved sugar in the pan. She uses a large non-stick pan or a large dark pan, but because she's been making it for years, I'm gonna keep with my advice of using a lighter pan, but I will say I found using a larger saucepan than a smaller one much better for making the sauce. She heats her sugar on medium-low heat, and once most of it has dissolved, stirs the caramel with gumption while it bubbles away. Now, this is a key. According to Andrea's comments on her Instagram, she has never made caramel with water, but heating and stirring the sauce once the sugar is dissolved is key to retaining enough heat to swirl around your baking dish once you remove it from the heat. Really studying Andrea's techniques got me to the best caramel sauce I've ever made for flan. I always err on the side of caution with caramel because it's something you need to work fast with, but in all my previous caramel sauces for flan, it had been a lack of stirring that meant my sugar was likely not fully dissolved, because I could see in the set caramel sauce in my dishes there were still tiny granules, even though I was using caster sugar, which is a finer granulated sugar anyway. Cooking until simmering ensures the sugar is all fully dissolved and will provide the right texture to coat the entire base of your baking dish. And I've noticed that even though it is a light caramel color, the sugar is not necessarily see-through, which means it's still not fully dissolved, and you tend to have slightly more time than you think. It doesn't go from like this light caramel to a dark caramel in 30 seconds. Then you will achieve the right texture that will swirl beautifully around your baking dish. Whilst doing research after having 2 failed caramel sauces soaking in my kitchen sink, someone mentioned in a comment section that they'd ruined a few caramel sauces, but they add 1 to 2 ladlefuls of warm water to their sauce and they stir, and then they return it to the heat where they continue stirring for 1 to 2 minutes. And this doesn't just help the caramel stop cooking, but also ensures it doesn't just go a darker color as quickly as without the water. It also ensures the texture remains workable while they coat the dishes. You do have to proceed with some caution when doing this method though, as the sauce will splutter when you're adding that warm water, so you need to be able to work in complete peace, having no distractions, no children or anything that could then distract you, and you could end up with hot caramel on children or yourself. Once you have that nice smooth sauce, well, when you remove it from the heat it's incredibly hot, but it's also important to remember prepped caramel hardens fast. When it comes down to adding to your dish, Chef's Resource provides helpful advice. When pouring the caramel into your ramekins, work with efficient, deliberate movements. You have to rotate the pan immediately to coat the bottom and some of the sides before it hardens. Quoting there again from an expert's tips to nail your flan. When I say that the caramel sets quickly, well, it sets so fast, as stated by Chef's Resource. As soon as the sugar touches the cool ceramic or glass surface of the mold, it begins to harden. You have roughly 10 to 15 seconds to tilt and rotate the mold to coat the bottom evenly before the caramel sets into a brittle layer. It's vital to ensure the caramel has completely cooled before pouring over the custard. Well, on that note, the custard. If the caramel layer is like jewelry on a look, then the custard is the main outfit. The custard in flan is where ingredients get a little more interesting, and there are several types of dairy and flavoring options. Before we get into those ingredients, we're going to start with a key ingredient to virtually all custards: eggs. They are imperative here, as they don't just help to provide the color and flavor, but also set the texture within the dessert. This is best explained in the book on baking, a textbook of baking and pastry fundamentals by Sarah Lubenski, Priscilla A. Martel, and Eddie Van Dame. Whole eggs are used in a simple egg custard such as flan to provide both richness from the fat in the yolk and structure from the protein in the white. This is important in order for the flan to maintain its shape when unmolded. Every single one of the 24 recipes in my research included whole eggs, and 4 included a mixture of whole eggs and egg yolks. And wonderful Cassie Mendita from I Bake Mistakes expands: when using whole eggs, the whites provide additional protein without the added fat from using 100% egg yolks. These proteins are what give the final flan a firmer, almost bouncy consistency. Overall, when using whole eggs, the flan is lighter in color and flavor. None of the 24 recipes in my research call for egg yolks only, but if yours does, Cassie Mendita best explains that using all egg yolks, on the other hand, provide fat and richness with a smooth, creamy texture, though the lack of whites means losing the structure their proteins provide. While yolks are not completely devoid of proteins, they do not have nearly enough to have the same effect using whites would. If you're seeking a custard with a richer and creamier texture with a more enhanced yellow color, then having more egg yolks in your custard than whole eggs is a better option. Whereas if you prefer a slightly firmer but still bouncy texture, a flan made with only whole eggs is the better option. If you're working with a beloved family recipe but you personally prefer a slightly different custard, well, you can amend the recipe to achieve a texture more in line with your preference. Tasting Table recommend a couple of whole eggs being replaced by an equal number of egg yolks, or by using half the amount of whole eggs and the other half as egg yolks. Now this is best done done though, as Cassie Mendita notes, when making the swaps for eggs, you have to go gram for gram. So if you want to sub egg yolks for whole eggs, instead of subbing 2 yolks for 2 eggs, you'd sub 2 to 3 yolks for 1 egg, because each yolk weighs 15 to 20 grams, whereas a whole egg weighs 50 grams. Now, the size of your eggs come into being a factor here, because those weights that Cassie provided are more on the larger side. Virtually all American recipes will mean large eggs, even when they're just calling for it just says eggs, which weigh around 55 grams with an egg yolk weight of approximately 18 grams. So if the recipe is calling for eggs and it's an American recipe, or it is specifying large eggs, 3 egg yolks will successfully replace 1 whole egg. But if you're working with smaller eggs, a scale is a good thing to have on hand to calculate the amount of yolks needed here so that the custard sets perfectly. Because flan is one of those desserts that is incredibly personal and in so many parts of the globe has likely been a part of some very important celebrations and events, I don't really feel saying that using whole eggs or only egg yolks or a mixture of both is better here, because you know what you love about this dessert when you're consuming it, and that is really what ultimately should help you decide what you're going to use when making this. Though, if you're not sure and you've tasted flan but you've never made it, well, Tasting Table provide their opinion here. The bottom line is that a compromise of whole eggs and egg yolks is essential to achieving the best flan. Whole eggs will contribute to a firm texture, while egg yolks will add richness. Now, some people actually have an allergy to eggs, and no flan or custard is actually the same without this pivotal ingredient, though there are a bunch of vegan flan recipes that you can find online that provide an eggless alternative. Now, I very quickly reviewed 3 of these recipes, and they all used agar-agar powder as a replacement for the eggs. Now, this is a vegan gelatin that helps to provide the right texture, though the result will be more in line with a panna cotta, because the eggs is what makes this dish what it is. Now, if you're not vegan, you could actually replace vegan gelatin like agar-agar with regular gelatin, but you do need to know that gelatin and agar-agar cannot be replaced or substituted in equal measure, so you're going to have to do your research and ensure you're using the right amount for the dessert to have the right texture. Also, if you're not vegan, well, whatever dairy your recipe is calling for, it can be used as normal. On the topic of dairy, 13 of the 24 recipes in my research call for only milk, with an additional 7 calling for a separate dairy alongside milk. Thanks to the article Egg Coagulation in the Kitchen Custards, we see why dairy is so vital here, as it's providing the right environment for the eggs to set. The more liquid we add, the sparser the protein network and the more delicate the custard. All recipes that call for milk are calling for whole milk, which has a higher fat content and creamier mouthfeel, so it's complementary to the eggs and sugar in our recipe. Chef's Resource explains why this is such a pivotal ingredient. The primary role of milk in flan is to distribute heat slowly, preventing the egg proteins from curdling too quickly. Okay, so for anyone who actually just hates whole milk or prefers using lower fat varieties, well, let's consider if you can replace it here. Using skim milk drastically increases the water content, which prevents the egg proteins from binding properly. The lesson is pretty clear. Whether milk is the only dairy called for, or it's used in conjunction with another dairy product, whole is best. One of the recipes in my research called for milk, but in the instructions it requires cooking it down until it's more of an evaporated milk. Well, in her article Flan by Cassie Mendita from I Bake Mistakes, Cassie explains what evaporated milk is. Traditionally a key player in flan, it's fresh milk that's been heated to the point that 60% of the water content evaporates. Through this process, the final product is a little sweeter and a little creamier than fresh milk. And Food Network expands, the thick, creamy and caramel colored liquid adds sweetness and richness to all manner of desserts without the moisture content of regular milk. Only 1 of 3 recipes using evaporated milk calls for it without milk alongside. This means the creamier texture with less water content when compared to whole milk creates a smooth baked custard. Now, this is going to be ever so slightly sweeter than when simply using whole milk, because it's a more concentrated product. It's helpful to know that evaporated milk can be subbed in for milk. For the time being, we're going to set evaporated milk to the side and consider sweetened, also known simply as condensed milk. 5 of the 24 recipes in my research call for sweetened condensed milk. In one recipe, it is the only only dairy used, another calls for evaporated and condensed, and 3 call for milk and condensed. Chef's Resource notes, it provides the necessary sugar for the set and replaces the need for extra cream due to its reduced water content and high solids. And one of the best reasons for making flan with sweetened condensed milk is because the sugar content is so high it effectively binds the water in the milk, resulting in a custard that is almost impossible to overcook or curdle, providing the heat remains low. We'll come back to baking it, but in the meantime there is one other dairy that might be called for in a flan recipe, with 3 of the 24 recipes calling for cream, though only one calls solely for cream. Of the 3 recipes, one doesn't specify what type of cream is required, one calls for heavy cream, and another calls for whipping or even half and half alongside milk. Cassie Mendita once again reminds us why cream can be a great ingredient, particularly for creamy desserts like flan. Fat is flavor and fat is texture. Heavy cream has a fat percentage of 36%. Now, a recipe that calls for cream or a mixture of cream and milk means you have more control over the sugar or sweetness of the custard. Now, the cream can also mean a richer, creamier custard. According to the Global Cold Chain Alliance, which is an organization for cold stuffs, I mean, the roads we go down for these videos, evaporated milk has at least 7.5% fat content, whilst sweetened condensed has at least 8.7%. So that fat is pretty consistent between them, whilst whole milk is sitting at around 3.5% fat. Food Sky explains the difference in fat content between cream types. Half and half should be at least 10.5 to 12%, but not higher than 18%. Sitting around double that, the fat content of whipping cream, which is between 30 to 36%, and we see the content in heavy cream is at least 36%. Sharing the fat content is to note the type of flavor and texture you're creating, because as Cassie says, fat is texture and flavor. Though fat in a dessert can also make it heavy on the palate, with Chef's Resource providing some great advice when using it here. While it creates a richer dessert, it is not too heavy as long as you balance the fats with the correct number of eggs. Keep the ratio to about 1 part cream to 3 parts milk. When a flan calls for cream, it helps to think about what it's bringing to the dish. It's helping to create a smooth flavor profile with creamier undertones than when simply using just milk, and like any of the other dairy ingredients, it helps the custard set uniformly. Like milk, it's also helpful to remember heavy cream also has a lower sugar content than evaporated milk, making it a little less sweet in comparison. So if we want slightly more control over the sweetness in our dessert, it's better to choose milk, cream, or a mixture of the two. If we want a slightly sweeter or caramel flavor, the milk can be replaced with evaporated. Ultimately, if a flan calls for more than one dairy, it's likely that it's helping to create a more balanced flavor on our palate. In the recipe on my website actually uses 3 types of dairy: condensed, whole, and cream, for a super tender custard. Like the caramel sauce, there is really only a small mixture of refined white sugars in the 24 recipes in my research. 13 of the recipes don't specify the type of sugar at all, but some do include gram amounts which align with white or refined white sugars, and the color of the custard indicates virtually every one of those flans did use granulated white or caster sugar in their recipes. 5 of the 24 recipes call for granulated, and a further 1 each call for white or caster sugar. Now, refined white sugar does in the custard what it does in the caramel. It creates a neutral sweetness. This helps create a smooth flavor without adding additional undertones. 2 of the recipes in my research omitted sugar, thanks to one including condensed milk, whilst the other uses evaporated and condensed. In many traditional custards, there are only 3 ingredients: milk, sugar, and eggs. And what the sugar and milk do in the custard is to slow the coagulation or setting or thickening of the eggs as they cook to create that jiggly, soft, and melt in your mouth texture. Lost in Science explains The different proteins coagulate at different temperatures, but overall a whole egg that's yolk and white combined sets at about 73 degrees Celsius. But in custard, it's diluted. A basic recipe is 1 whole egg to 1 cup of milk and 1 tablespoon of sugar. So it thickens at a higher temperature, about 78 to 80 degrees Celsius. A whole egg sets at 73 degrees Celsius or 163 degrees Fahrenheit, but that's increased with the dairy and sugar to 78 to 80 degrees Celsius or 172 to 176 degrees Fahrenheit. The sugar is coating and physically blocking the proteins from getting together until the temperature rises further. Notes Guy Crosby from America's Test Kitchen regarding the proteins in the eggs that will adhere together. And without the sugar, it would set quickly and create a firm crust, which is just like absolutely not the texture we're looking for in a flan.
That's obviously not what I want.
As none of the recipes in my research call for alternative sugars, it's likely that other types would add additional flavors that in some cases might overpower the flavor of the dish. On the topic of flavoring the dish, well, 20 of the 24 recipes call for some type of flavoring to the custard. 13 of these simply call for vanilla extract or essence. I can't remember how many called for which, but these we're just going to lump them together in this scenario. Though extract is made by soaking vanilla beans in alcohol, usually vodka or rum, for at least 3 months, and it has a much stronger vanilla flavor, whereas much cheaper vanilla essence is synthetically flavored and colored. Though vanilla is not an essential ingredient here, it does help to add dimension to our baked goods. In this case, it's going to help cut through the flavors of those eggs or richness of the dairy that is being used, balancing all the ingredients to create the right dimension to the custard. A further 6 recipes call for vanilla alongside other ingredients from orange to lemon peel to cardamom, cloves, or rose water. Citrus peels contain oils, so this helps to cut through some of the richer elements in the eggs or cream, condensed milk, etc. Spices act in a similar way to citrus peels, so add what you prefer to your custard if you're not a purist. If this is the first time you've seen one of my videos, well, let me introduce you to the fact that I am obsessed with infusions, which I do talk about in this posset video. One thing you could actually try if your recipe calls for milk or cream is to measure out your liquid you need for the recipe into a container that has a lid, and you could add in citrus peels to cold infuse in your fridge overnight, or you could add the milk and cream to a saucepan and heat on low with citrus peels or even a vanilla bean or even spices until lightly simmering at the edges of your saucepan before allowing to cool completely. This will strengthen the undertones and you can then discard those flavorings at the time you're making the custard. One point that is small but relevant when it comes to flavorings, as stated by Katie Straw in The Unique History of Flan, a world-traveled dessert, the Mexicans took flan to a whole new level. They created coffee, chocolate, and even coconut flavors, and the recipes became popular not only in Mexico but the rest of Latin America. You could take some inspiration and use coconut milk in place of your milk, or add a little strong coffee, though we know vanilla is a classic for good reason for the purists out there. Only 8 of the recipes in my research call for salt in their custard. Now this might seem a little silly as an ingredient in a custard, but Cassie Mendita from I Bake Mistakes explains why it is helpful to add. Salt is going to mellow out and balance the sweet while bringing forward the milky notes of the cream. Now salt is known for offsetting bitterness, so if you happen to have caramelized your sugar just a little too much, adding salt to your custard should help create a more balanced flavor in a spoonful of flan. If you're working with a beloved flan recipe and it doesn't call for salt, well, add 1/8 of a teaspoon or a pinch to your custard and see what you think of the flavor. You might actually be surprised making it. In the article, Discover the Timeless Delight of Flan by Fonz, a well-made flan should have a silky, smooth texture that melts in your mouth. Now, I wasn't actually going to go into the whole process of making flan because let's face reality, it's really not that difficult and it doesn't take much time at all. You basically whisk up ingredients and then you strain into your baking dish. Well, in the way we mix our ingredients together, we can actually set ourselves up for failure. And that silky smooth texture we're looking to have created might have actually disappeared before we even put it into our oven. Virtually all the recipes in my research were pretty brief in their directions, and though flan doesn't take much time to prepare, as I already mentioned, King Arthur baking notes: if you overbeat heat the mixture of milk, sugar, and dairy, you can add air, which can lead to bubbles and a flan with a spongy surface. To avoid this pitfall, blend the dairy ingredients first until smooth, then add the eggs and blend briefly. As King Arthur Baking notes, some recipes will call for blending all the custard ingredients together, and though this is great, it can actually result in more bubbles, and I actually saw at least one recipe that said make the custard and then let it sit for a while so that the custard has time for the bubbles to disintegrate. But you don't actually need to do this. In my experience, I found it's easiest to whisk or blend all the other ingredients together, and then you whisk the eggs into the dairy with like a folding action. So what you're doing is you're breaking the eggs with minimal mixing, and I had barely any bubbles in my mixture. I found this creates a much smoother mixture with minimal effort and only slightly longer mixing time. And when I'm saying slightly longer, it's literally only like a minute or two. It's really minimal. But this means that you're breaking up the eggs as much as possible into the dairy, incorporating those ingredients, but with as little movement as possible. And once we've done that, it's best to always skim any foam off the top to avoid bubbles in the cooked flan, and strain the custard through a fine mesh sieve. Don't press anything through. I've seen some recipes recommend straining the custard up to 3 times to really ensure it's smooth and devoid of as many bubbles as possible. But if you're incorporating the eggs into your dairy base in the way that I just mentioned, there won't be many to begin with, so you'll only need to strain it once. Now that we've strained the custard and poured it over our caramel sauce, it's time for the heat. The majority of flan recipes around the world requires baking it, though some use the steam method, reflecting a common denominator between them. The use of hot water, with Scruff and Steph recommending use medium hot water from the tap for the bain-marie rather than boiling water from the kettle. The one time I used boiling water from the kettle, the flans formed bubbles on the sides, so now I only ever use medium hot water from the tap. Whilst all the ingredients contribute something to the overall texture of the dessert, baking in a water bath, as Cassie Mendita from iBake's Mistakes explains, is a non-negotiable for flan and custard baking. Using a water bath moderates and ensures even direct heating while baking. The water bath keeps the heat from spiking, helping to avoid overcooking. Or in other words, this method helps to ensure even cooking and prevent the custard from curdling. This gentle heat results in a smooth, creamy texture. Like baking in a water bath, the temperature in the oven is key, as Cassie from iBake Mistakes notes. Baking the flan at too high a temp without a water bath will essentially cause the flan to boil, pushing out the water content and creating bubbly, too stiff, eggy tasting flan. Baking at lower temps promotes even baking. This gives the flan a chance to bake evenly without the outer edges over baking and becoming bubbly or eggy. Cassie bakes hers for 2 to 3 hours at a low temperature of around 135 degrees Celsius or 275 degrees Fahrenheit. One side note regarding steaming and baking flan is that many people will cover their custard with aluminum foil, which is pierced to allow steam to escape. For steaming, the heat is not going to exceed 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit, so you can likely stick to the cooking time exactly to the minute. Whereas when baking, the temperature is likely going to be a bit higher, and therefore if it's covered, you're less likely to know when your custard is done. With King Arthur Baking notes what you're looking for when it's perfect. Remove your flan from the oven when it's set around the edges but still has a soft jiggle in the center like jello. If you're following a recipe as is, I'd aim to let it bake for around the timing is set out, though you might want to check the flan around 5 minutes before the time and see how jiggly it is. If you've switched out a few eggs for more egg yolks, well, it's important to consider this tip from Cassie Mendita. Flan made with more whole eggs will tend to bake faster than a flan with more or all yolks. As usual, baking is scientific, and this is important to consider if you're making changes to the amount of eggs in your custard.
It's science.
King Arthur Baking notes what the texture of your custard will be when it's baked, not just right. Undercooking results in a runny custard that won't hold its shape when unmolded, while overcooking results in a firm, eggy custard filled with holes throughout. Ultimately, you know what you're looking for in a perfect flan, and remember that whilst it'll have a jiggle in the oven, it will continue cooking somewhat once removed to set further. Once it's baked, remove from the oven, but let it sit in the water bath until the water is with room temperature, then discard the water bath and transfer the flan to the fridge to chill until fully set, at least 6 hours, but preferably overnight. Now, letting it sit in the water bath brings the temperature of the custard down evenly and slowly and ensures your caramel will slide out once you've refrigerated it. However, you also need to consider that it's going to continue cooking in that residual heat. Now, the previous advice from King Arthur Baking to remove the flan from the oven when the edges have just set, but the custard is still jiggly, is imperative here. With the continued cooking in the water once removed from the oven, you do risk overcooking it if you bake it for even like 5 minutes longer. You know the edges are set because they will hold when you jiggle the dish. If the custard is more jiggly and only the edges are set, well then that's the sweet spot. Even on a warm day, the water will cool in about 10 to 15 minutes. And if you're using hot tap water and not boiling water, well, the temperature of the water will obviously cool quicker anyway. Flan is one of those desserts that's absolutely best made 1 to 2 days prior to serving. You want to give it a real rest time between baking and serving here. When you're ready to serve, King Arthur Baking provides the following advice. To unmold, run a thin knife around the edges, then dip the bottom of the pan in a larger dish filled with warm water. The one you used for your water bath is a good choice for 10 to 15 seconds to loosen the caramel. I find going around the baking dish 2 to 3 times to ensure the edges are really loosened, and this avoids it from sticking. Also, if you're setting the dish in warm water, you'll need to dry the dish before inverting it so that no water gets into your caramel. Chef and baker Beth O'Brien had the mammoth task of making 9 different types of flan a few years ago for an Irish website, and gives some great advice if you don't want to do what King Arthur Baking are advising there. When taking them out of the molds, loosen around the edge with a knife and then put a plate on top and flip it over with force. And King Arthur Baking advises, with one hand on the plate and the other under the pan, flip it swiftly and confidently. You should have a plate with a smooth sauce drizzling over the surface and a perfectly lightly jiggly custard underneath to serve up and dig into. When considering a successful flan, there are some vital things to remember. For a caramel sauce to spread smoothly over your baking dish, it needs to be simmering before you then remove it from the heat. And you need to stir the sauce once most of the sugar is dissolved. The caramel needs to be fully cooled before you pour over your custard. A custard with whole eggs or a mixture of whole and egg yolks will bake faster than one made with simply egg yolks. Whisking the custard ingredients and then adding in the eggs and incorporating slowly is best to help avoid creating too many bubbles and avoiding like a bubbly texture in your flan. It is vital to strain the custard into your baking dish. Hot water trumps boiling water for a nice smooth consistency. Once the custard is set at the edges but still jiggly throughout, remove from the oven and allow to cool in the water to room temperature, and you have to refrigerate for several hours, ideally overnight. Loosen the flan around the edges, and if you want to ensure all the caramel slides out, you could set the dish in warm water for 10 to 15 seconds. Making flan can feel really overwhelming, I'm not going to lie, but those that make it and have successfully seen it made by loved ones definitely have more of an idea what they're doing when compared to those of us who didn't grow up with it. If you've been running a little blind like I was, well, I hope you found something a little helpful in this video in your future flan endeavors. Now, if you've watched this all the way through, thank you so much for your time. I'm actually now running late for plans with a friend. For those who are curious of the countries of the flan recipes that were included, well, they are all linked in the caption. I'm a little wary that some people will be offended that their country was omitted. The 8 countries are Mexico, India, Vietnam, Chile, Bangladesh, Spain, Portugal, and Puerto Rico. Some will say Chilean isn't flan, but I already explained why it is. And I felt a real responsibility with this video to reflect countries that normally would be overlooked, and therefore France was not included so that like India could be. Do not get offended at me. France has had its day in the spotlight for centuries, so it's only time to like really reflect some other countries as well. Do let me know in the comments if there's any specific dessert or dish you would like me to consider. I'm currently reading a book on salt, and if you've seen an Instagram video about this by a guy, well, you will know exactly why. I haven't gotten a lot of information regarding science and baking though. Even if you have any baking queries you want me to cover in the future, in the meantime, I will see you in the next one. Ka kite anō and tschüss.
Boy, that flan was good.